My question would be addressed to Professor Meehan, I hope I have your name correct. I'd like to bring the whole thing back to something very, very simple. I have never heard an Irish person say, I am a European. For that matter, a Spanish or an Italian person has never said it. We only see, whether you like it or not, we see Europe as a place for structural funds or cap financing, whatever it might be. And we've never embraced the idea of individuals being part of this wonderful idea of somehow unity across Europe. And I mean, if you ask an American, when you ask him, where's he from? Oh, I am from the United States of America, but we don't do that. And I think the failure very much is in Brussels. You had a chance when this thing was set up to somehow embrace the whole lot of us in this wonderful adventure and bring us as individuals. And if you could do that, that we as individuals, rather than this bureaucracy that's going on, I think all sorts of wonderful things are possible. But without the individuals subscribing to this wonderful idea, I think we are failing. And I would even argue the case that perhaps Brussels should have even a television station to reach out to us as individuals and tell us what you are about. And I would wonder if Professor Meehan could answer to that, please.
Certainly. I think, first of all, what Americans call themselves, you have to be very careful about your history here, because I think I did in the wars, people said they were fighting for California or Texas, and the interstate relations in the United States were always called international relations. The relations across the state boundaries. International commerce was interstate commerce. And it's really, I suppose, it was quite a long time before the overarching understanding of yourself as American took place. You were Virginian, you were Texan, you were Mexican, you were, I don't know, whatever else. I think in the United Kingdom, at least in the Great Britain part of it, it is true that it would not be true that nobody calls themselves European, but they might call themselves that very low down on a list of other identities that they have: Welsh, British, European, or Scottish, British, European, and so on. I think it may be a problem in Northern Ireland because identifying, how you identify yourself.
Don't go there.
All right, okay, I won't go there. So, but I don't think, but whether people call themselves Irish in the North, they did. Everybody did, whatever they were, until 1922. And then one section of the committee very rapidly stopped calling themselves Irish. So these things are not immutable, and they're very fluid. They depend on political circumstances and so on. So I wouldn't say it actually mattered very. The other point I just wanted to make, a Northern Irish poet, and I've just had a senior moment, and it's Michael Longley. I remember him saying that he never felt European, but he did now. And the first time he felt European was when he went to the United States on a lecture tour, and he realized that he was different from American.
Benoit, would you like to comment?
Yes, I would like to react to Brussels. Did you use the word Brussels? Because I live in Brussels. Brussels is my city, and it's funny because Brussels does not undertake enough steps in order to integrate Europe in Brussels. So I'm working on a daily basis with people of other European countries, and I think for more than 1 year now, and it's really interesting for me because I'm experiencing how far the Belgians, no, it's not, it's true, how far the Belgians are living from Europe. And I think we should really much more support the presence of the European institution as a real opportunity for us. On the cultural level. It's improving for the moment. There are a lot of projects, but we should develop much more the integration of Brussels in Europe. And what the European Commission and what the European Parliament decided with the foundations, it was a very important step. It was a small step, but I see the concrete consequences. It's probably on the continental, on the European level, it's marginal, but the public spaces in the 18th century, it was also marginal. Huh? The salon littéraire, the café littéraire, and so on, where they started to discuss on politics and on new ideas. It was also marginal at that time.
Mark and then Catherine.
Thank you. On a similar theme to the last speaker, on the idea of developing a notion of European citizenship, the one thing that you had to notice from the exchange that you mentioned that the European Parliament was how effectively Danny Cohn-Bendit was able to insult our MEP in his own language, and I wonder how many British MEPs would be able to...
the Earl.
Okay.
Yes, I wonder how many British MEPs would be able to insult Danny in either of his or any of his many languages. And I just wonder if the lack of, if you feel the lack of foreign language education in the UK and Ireland maybe holds back the development of that sort of European identity here. It's something we're very bad at.
Hold that question, take one then from Catherine. It's on.
Okay. I've listened today about solidarity, which I think is very important, interpersonal solidarity. You mentioned, for instance, the Greeks as opposed to the Finns. I've heard about participatory democracy. I've heard about active citizenship. I work with young people in college. I find I've also heard very interestingly B'nai Gupta talking about the advent of a European generation. And yet I find that an awful lot of young people actually know very little about Europe and are not particularly concerned about Europe, partly maybe because Europe has failed to explain itself to its citizens. And my question is, what would you advise that we do in order to get young people to participate more effectively? Because I think they're, maybe disenfranchised from politics, and particularly from electoral politics. And how are you going to get people to come out and vote? Because European elections, I think the turnout is relatively low. I think at best it's 50–55%. Sometimes it's as low as 30 to 40%. So how will you have democracy and democratic legitimacy in Europe if people don't vote?
The issue of language and citizenship and this issue of young people and democratic participation.
Yes. I can hardly understand. I can hardly answer on the issue of education in Ireland and Great Britain, but it's also the case. There is a lack of history of teaching history in Belgium too. It's a debate that's starting now, how to develop a better teaching of history in school. I think sometimes there is an interest that the people do not have the memory. So it's better not to know what's happened in the past sometimes. So this is maybe, for me, it's a really important political issue also for the Greens, teaching history. And I was impressed here because in Ireland, with Tommy yesterday, we feel the presence of history everywhere. Here, because he explained, but I think it's not only Tommy, it's much more living here for good reasons. But the history of Belgium was not that good. It was not always easy. But history is teaching history is a political issue for the youth. And I fully agree with you, there should be much more commitment of the European Union in selling itself, in explaining, in communicating. I think they are spending a lot of money, but I'm not sure that it is always in the good direction.
I think, it may things that may have got worse since when I was teaching, but from the 1980s through the 1990s, I used to regularly take my students to Leuven, where there's the Irish Institute, and people from the European Commission, the Council of Ministers, the Parliament, gave up their free time, and from organisations like Irish Farmers Union in Brussels or whatever, came and talked to them, and they invited us to visit the Parliament and the Commission and so on. And then there's very similar things happened at the NATO headquarters. We took our students regularly there. Now, I don't know whether those sorts of visits are available only to university students, or whether other young people visits can be organised. I must say, if you're one of their teachers, it's a bit of a nightmare, because you have to go on a bus from Belfast to Dover and in a boat. And so, because you've got to be with them, you can't just fly off and you're on your own and let them come under their own steam. And I must say, our students enjoyed it, even although they stayed up. Belgium, I don't know about now, but Belgian pubs don't close to the last person who leaves. So, the students were under strict orders. They had to be at these lectures because of people doing it from the kindness of their hearts. And anyway, they were very good. They got to bed about 7 in the morning and they were up at 9 for lecture. So, and they did actually, they learned a lot and they enjoyed themselves. I do think the language problem is a serious problem. It's been one in the United Kingdom for a very long time, I think since the time of Mrs. Thatcher's government, and they reduced the requirements for language learning at school. And I think we've always missed out on the boat of having it foreign languages taught from primary school age. I do think maybe Ireland and maybe Wales and maybe the northwest of Scotland have an advantage. There is a linguistic theory that once you've learned the first second language, the next second languages are much easier to learn, and maybe in situations where you're already speaking 2 languages, you might be an advantage.
Yes, I can confirm this because I had the chance to be born on the border. I learned, my first language was French, my mother language, and then I learned German, and then Dutch, and then English and then Dutch. I think it's very important, this feeling of being on the border, and I think other people can have this feeling of living on the border, of between 2 cultural worlds, even though they do not live physically on the border. And this feeling of living on the frontier is, for me, a good part of the European identity. And we should try in all manners to improve this, really, and to make it more accessible to much more people than nowadays.
You have a question here?
I would put some of the blame for the sense of powerlessness and the disconnect with Europe on our own national politicians. We have a government that is putting the blame for our problems on Europe. It's telling it the people that has no choices, it must do A, B, C. And the truth is that the Troika and the IMF are not as prescriptive as our government is telling us it is. I would also put blame on the extent to which we have ceded power to corporations. Earlier speakers spoke about natural resources, but we have handed over ownership of so many natural resources to corporations. And it is corporations, not governments, that are operating transnational essential infrastructure. And we now have these corporations lobbying our governments to have a place in our constitutions that may be recognised as legal individuals or legal entities in our corporations with private property rights. So I think the biggest single thing we could do to have a revolution is talk about private property rights and change what we mean, the meaning of private property rights in all of our constitutions.
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think I don't have a pat, easy response to it. But I think it's beginning to tie in a bit with what Vinny was talking about, that you have levels of governance to fit the scope of activity. And I think, Vinny, actually, I think that idea of, I think it's called co-terminosity or something, actually is quite an old idea. And it's there in the development of the Universal Postal Union. You have a level of governance covering the world because that function has to be carried out throughout the world. And it may be that corporations, we might be sort of thinking about a level of governance that can be coterminous with the activities of major private properties and corporations. But I need more notice to think about that.
You give us the opportunity to make a link with the discussion on the commons. It's an alternative way of considering property. We have a flyer of the GEF there behind you. You can. It's for me. It's really terra incognita that we have to discover, that we have to study, and I think that it's something for the Greens. Really, it's something that will differentiate us. That will make the difference in this century, not only for the Greens but for all the human beings.
We're going to draw matters to a close. I'd like to thank all our speakers, but before I do, I just want to maybe sum up some of the issues that have come out as a way of setting up the. And afterwards, the new logo will give us some logistical issues. Just on the last question of the property rights, it does seem to me that we as Greens have always stood for the issue of the commons, and that while not negating that under certain circumstances private property rights can be quite useful, these are always held in trust for society. And it does seem to me that when it comes to the issue of corporations, we do well to remind ourselves that historically corporations are set up to do particular functions, usually a piece of infrastructure, and then they were wound up. We've now given them legal personhood. I think it's time we can write in the rules of the game that under which economic entities actually operate. And see that politicising and democratising of our economy has always been part of what Greens are about. And it does seem to me that one of the issues that came out of this morning's session as a way of setting up the context for the next one is what Eamon was saying in terms of the stories and narratives. And it seems to me that one of the issues is, what's the story we're telling ourselves about this current crisis in Europe? Is it about the reclaiming of a social Europe? Is it a story of from breakdown from breakthrough, that we go for some level of federalism as well as subnational subsidiarity? It does seem to me that as Greens, it's an interesting prospect that Elizabeth raised of non-democratic federalism. That seems to be the economic equivalent of what, correct me if I'm wrong, I know Paul is here in the audience, Paul Sweeney, that we now have in the Republic of Ireland the concept now of jobless growth. That on the export side, there are certain signs that we are now beginning to see small developments of growth, but it's jobless. So you have jobless growth, who wants that? Or we can have non-democratic federalism. They seem to be, not things that we as Greens will particularly galvanise ourselves around. And in fact, there's a way of answering, or beginning to answer, Vinay's question in terms of, are we prepared to lose half our current salaries or in terms of resources? And I do think the Green European Foundation has done quite a lot in articulating a long-standing Green idea, but I think it's now time to actually put some flesh on the bones of the idea of degrowth, decroissance. What does that look like? It sounds very frightening in the context of an economic crisis that we as a political movement would be advocating degrowth when every other political party, social organisation wants us to get back to growth. I think that's a really challenging issue. I don't think anyone here in the room who are Greens want unplanned economic destruction, which is what we have at the moment. And it does seem to raise another issue that I think Eamon introduced, the cultural dimensions of this, the importance of mythological thinking. And it's an old standard view, certainly in Green ideas, that every society needs myths to live by, and ours just happens to be economic growth. We have the myth of economic growth. It's achieved full spectrum ideological common sense domination that we can't even begin to think. What would a high quality of life, low socioeconomic inequality, low carbon life actually look like? And it seems to me that that's the elements of a Green dimension to looking at the economic crisis, not just globally but certainly in Europe. How do we achieve low carbon, high human flourishing and low levels of socioeconomic inequality. And they seem to be the three criteria. If growth can achieve those, say, yeah, okay, let's have some. And of course, it's the issue about reclaiming growth is not the same as development. And I do think we're at this stage now, certainly in Europe, in this crisis, maybe the opportunity to really see that the social element of what social Europe means is in part a movement away from this neoliberal view of economic growth at any cost, which, as many of you know, as Greens, growth for its own sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. How do we begin to identify thresholds beyond which we can say that the engine of orthodox economic growth has done its job? The job now in Europe and in our society is redistribution. It's about the public provision of many of the goods and services that we need rather than this issue of private property rights. How can we separate use from ownership? It's what I call my academic work, how do we move from buildings, banks and boutiques? That was the basic old economic model. Buildings, property, banks, the financialisation and the growth of the financial sector, and boutiques, because I needed another B, basically debt-based consumerism. So how do we move from buildings, banks and boutiques, which has got us to the crisis that we're in, into what I would suggest from a green perspective is libraries, laundromats and light rail. Libraries are standing for how can we divorce ownership from use. I mean, I'm amazed in our 30 or almost 30 neoliberalised world that libraries still exist. They stand as a most radical critique of that idea that we have to privatise everything, have to commoditise everything, you need money in order to access particular goods and services. So how do we begin to see that around the idea of libraries, laundromats standing for socially provided goods and services, and light rail just as another L because it stands for, again, the issue is mobility. How in a highly connected, globalised world do we actually prioritise mobility as the issue with the resources and the needs that we have